Spring, 1944. The air war over Europe had turned into a brutal equation of numbers. Every morning, hundreds of American bombers crossed the English Channel heading toward factories, rail yards, and oil refineries deep inside the Reich. Escorting them were long lines of American fighters, Mustangs, Lightnings, and the massive Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Every afternoon the same thing happened. German fighters rose to meet them. The sky over occupied Europe became a battlefield measured in altitude, speed, and survival rates. Pilots counted victories and losses the way accountants tracked numbers in a ledger. Every engagement meant someone did not come home. German fighters held one clear advantage: altitude and the vertical fight. Aircraft like the Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt Bf 109 were deadly when diving away from combat. German pilots had perfected the tactic. When an American fighter tried to pursue, the German aircraft would roll into a steep dive and disappear toward the ground at terrifying speed. Most American pilots could not safely follow. Not in the P-47 Thunderbolt. The Thunderbolt, nicknamed the Jug by its pilots, was one of the largest single-engine fighters ever built. Fully loaded, it weighed nearly 7 tons. 50 caliber machine guns lined its wings. A massive turbo-supercharged radial engine produced over 2,000 horsepower. It could absorb punishment that would destroy most fighters. But it had a terrifying weakness. In a steep dive at very high speed, the aircraft could become almost impossible to control. Past about 450 miles per hour, strange aerodynamic forces began to take over. The airflow over the wings and tail changed dramatically. Pilots called it compressibility. The effect was terrifying. The control stick would stiffen until it barely moved. Rudder pedals froze. The nose continued dropping into the dive, while the pilot struggled with controls that suddenly felt welded into place. Some pilots pulled so hard they fractured bones. Others never recovered. Several Thunderbolts had already slammed into the ground after uncontrollable dives. The official doctrine became very clear. Do not pursue enemy fighters in a steep dive. If a German aircraft escaped downward, pilots were ordered to break off the chase and climb back to altitude. It was frustrating. Every German who escaped today could return tomorrow. But the alternative was worse. Trying to follow meant risking death. By early 1944, this limitation was simply accepted as reality. Engineers had tried to solve the problem with different trim settings and mechanical adjustments. Nothing worked. The Thunderbolt was a powerful aircraft, but the laws of physics were unforgiving. And then a 19-year-old pilot accidentally changed everything. Second Lieutenant Robert L. Booth was not the kind of pilot anyone expected to make history. He was quiet, careful, and methodical. Booth struggled during early pursuit training and had to repeat part of the program after falling behind other cadets. Instructors described him in similar terms. Not brilliant, not flashy, but dependable. He eventually graduated in the middle of his class and was sent to England in March of 1944. At 19 years old, he arrived at RAF Boxstead, home of the legendary 56th Fighter Group. The unit had already earned a reputation. Their Thunderbolts carried distinctive wolf head nose art. The pilots proudly called themselves the Wolf Pack. Most of the men there had already flown numerous combat missions. Booth had flown exactly 5. Trust among fighter pilots came slowly. Staying alive depended on the skill of the man flying beside you, and new pilots had to prove themselves. Booth had not yet done that. He followed orders. He stayed in formation, but he had not fired his guns in combat. Not once. On the morning of April 18, 1944, Booth climbed into his Thunderbolt for another escort mission. The target that day was Brandenburg, Germany. Weather conditions were miserable. Thick cloud layers stacked between 8 and 20,000 feet. Visibility was poor, and the bomber formations were running late. The fighters orbited over the English Channel while waiting for the bombers to assemble. Booth flew in the least glamorous position of the formation. Tail end Charlie, the last aircraft in line. The spot reserved for the newest pilots. Inside the cockpit, the smell of oil and hot metal filled the air. Booth checked his instruments every few seconds. Fuel pressure, oil temperature, manifold pressure. Everything looked normal. But his hands were cold inside his gloves. And somewhere ahead, beyond the clouds, German fighters were waiting. The radio crackled suddenly. Bandits. High north side. The warning snapped through the formation like electricity. A second later, the German fighters appeared. 4 dark shapes dropped out of the sunlight above the cloud layer. Focke-Wulf 190s, diving fast toward the American formation. They came in like hawks. The attack lasted only seconds. The German fighters fired a quick burst through the Thunderbolt formation and then split apart in different directions before the Americans could react. Booth's squadron broke formation immediately. His element leader banked hard to the right and dove after one of the Germans. Booth followed automatically, the Thunderbolt rolling onto its side before plunging down through a break in the clouds. The world changed instantly. Above them had been cold gray cloud. Below them was the green countryside of occupied France. Fields, roads, a winding river, and one German fighter racing low along the valley. The FW-190 was flying barely 50 feet above the ground, following the river like a snake through the countryside. Booth's leader closed the distance quickly and opened fire. Tracers streaked forward toward the German aircraft. The German pilot reacted instantly. The fighter snapped into a violent left turn and disappeared behind a line of trees along the riverbank. Booth's leader broke off. He pulled up sharply and climbed back toward the cloud layer. Booth didn't follow. For a moment, he was hypnotized by the spot where the German had vanished. Then he saw movement. The FW-190 suddenly shot upward from behind the trees, climbing sharply into the sky. The German pilot rolled his aircraft over the top of the climb and pointed the nose straight back down toward the valley. Booth reacted without thinking. He shoved the stick forward and dove after him. The Thunderbolt began to accelerate. 300 miles per hour. The heavy fighter gathered speed like a locomotive rushing downhill. Below him, the river twisted through the valley like a ribbon of steel. Booth was now barely 200 feet above the ground. The German fighter pulled out of the dive ahead of him and began climbing again. Booth fired. His aim was wrong. The tracers passed behind the German aircraft. The FW-190 rolled inverted at the top of the climb and dove again. Booth tried to follow. He pushed the stick forward harder. The nose dropped steeper. The airspeed indicator kept climbing. For 100 miles per hour. Then it happened. The controls froze. The stick suddenly felt like it had been welded into place. Booth pulled back. Nothing. He pulled harder. The stick barely moved. The Thunderbolt continued diving. The river rushed toward him. The altimeter spun downward. 1,500 feet. 1,200, 1,000. The dive steepened to nearly 70 degrees. Booth planted both boots against the instrument panel and hauled back on the stick with everything he had. The control moved maybe an inch. The nose lifted slightly, but not enough. He was going to hit the ground. The aircraft screamed through the air at nearly 450 miles per hour, the wings shuddering violently. The Thunderbolt had entered the compressibility zone pilots feared more than enemy fighters. There was no time to think. Only panic. Booth reached toward the control panel beside him. His hand was shaking. He wanted the flap lever. Some half-formed instinct told him that more drag might slow the aircraft. But in the vibrating cockpit, he grabbed the wrong control. He pulled the landing gear lever. The landing gear dropped instantly into the slipstream. The effect was explosive. The Thunderbolt slammed into the air like it had hit an invisible wall. Drag multiplied instantly. The aircraft decelerated violently. The nose pitched upward with enormous force. Booth was thrown forward against his harness as the horizon spun across his windshield. The airplane rolled. Suddenly, he was upside down, climbing. For a split second, Booth had no idea what had happened. The airspeed dropped rapidly. The controls came alive again. He pushed the stick and rolled the aircraft upright by instinct. The Thunderbolt leveled out. Altitude, 3,000 feet. Airspeed, 210 miles per hour. The controls felt completely normal. Booth looked around. The German fighter was gone. The river valley had disappeared behind him. Above him was only empty sky and scattered clouds. For several seconds, he simply sat there breathing. His hands were shaking so badly, he could barely hold the stick. Then a warning light caught his eye. The landing gear indicator was glowing. Only then did he realize what he had done. He raised the landing gear. The wheels retracted smoothly into the wings. The Thunderbolt steadied and continued flying as if nothing unusual had happened. Booth climbed back up through the cloud layer and eventually found his formation again. No one asked where he had been. The mission continued. But that night, lying on his bunk in the dim light of the barracks, Booth kept replaying the moment in his mind. The dive, the frozen controls, the wrong lever, the recovery. It made no sense. Lowering the landing gear in a dive was not a recovery procedure. It wasn't in any manual. It wasn't taught in training. And yet, it had saved his life. He should have been dead at the bottom of that valley. Instead, he had pulled out of the dive with altitude to spare. The more he thought about it, the more the physics began to make sense. The landing gear created enormous drag. The drag slowed the aircraft. The speed reduction restored control authority. A mistake. But maybe not just luck. Maybe something else. Booth did not know it yet. But the wrong lever he pulled in panic was about to change the way every Thunderbolt pilot fought the war. For 2 days, Robert Booth tried to forget about the dive. But the more he replayed it in his mind, the more it bothered him. Not because it had frightened him. Combat frightened everyone. What bothered him was the logic. Every Thunderbolt pilot had been taught the same thing. Once the aircraft passed roughly 450 miles per hour in a dive, the controls would lock. Compressibility would take over. The nose would tuck down harder, and the pilot would have almost no ability to pull out. It had killed men. Booth had seen the reports. But he had pulled out. Not with strength. Not with luck. With drag. The landing gear had slowed the airplane so violently that control authority returned almost instantly. It should not have worked. But it had. On the 3rd day, Booth finally mentioned it during debriefing. His flight leader, a captain from Texas with a distinguished flying cross and 12 kills, listened quietly while Booth explained what had happened. The captain leaned back in his chair. Then he shrugged. "Kid," he said, "panic makes you do strange things." The room laughed. The captain told Booth he had simply been lucky. "Next time," he added, "don't chase Germans through river valleys." The discussion ended there. But Booth could not let it go. That evening he walked across the airfield and knocked on the door of the squadron engineering officer. The engineering officer was a quiet first lieutenant who had flown 10 missions before a minor injury moved him to ground duty. He understood the P-47 Thunderbolt better than most pilots. Booth explained everything again. The dive, the lock controls, the wrong lever, the recovery. The engineer listened carefully. When Booth finished, the lieutenant rubbed his chin. "You dropped the gear at 450 miles an hour?" Booth nodded. "That should have ripped the doors off the airplane." It didn't. The lieutenant stood up and walked to a chalkboard covered with diagrams of the Thunderbolt's hydraulic systems. He began sketching quickly. "Landing gear creates drag," he said slowly. "Drag reduces velocity." He paused. "And reduced velocity restores elevator authority." Booth said nothing. The engineer finished the sketch and stared at it. "It makes sense," he admitted. "But it's dangerous. Deploying the landing gear at extreme speed could destroy the aircraft. The gear struts might tear free. The hydraulic lines could rupture. If the wheels failed to retract afterward, the pilot would be stuck flying a slow, crippled airplane across enemy territory." But the idea stayed with him. The engineering officer wrote a short report. 2 days later, Booth was summoned to the group commander's office. The commander of the 56th Fighter Group was Colonel Hubert Zemke, one of the most respected fighter leaders in the European theater. Zemke had 22 confirmed victories. He did not waste time. He told Booth to sit down and describe exactly what had happened. Booth repeated the story carefully, step by step. Zemke asked only a few questions. "How fast were you when the controls locked?" "About 450 miles per hour." "How much altitude did you lose?" 500 feet. "Maybe less." "And the gear retracted normally afterward?" "Yes, sir." Zemke leaned back in his chair. For nearly a minute, he said nothing. Finally, he spoke. "We're going to test it." Booth blinked. Zemke continued. "Controlled conditions. High altitude. Camera plane behind you. If the idea worked, it could save pilots. If it failed, they would forget it ever happened." The test was scheduled for April 25, 1944. Booth's Thunderbolt climbed to 20,000 feet over eastern England. Behind him, another P-47 carried a wing-mounted K-24 camera to record the test. Booth leveled off and checked his instruments. Oil pressure normal. Manifold pressure steady. Fuel tanks balanced. Everything looked exactly like a normal training flight. Except for what he was about to do. He pushed the stick forward. The Thunderbolt rolled slightly and began to dive. At first the descent felt routine. 30 degrees. 40. 50. The airspeed indicator climbed. 300 miles per hour. The controls began to stiffen. Booth pushed further. The nose dropped steeper. 60 degrees. 420 miles per hour. The control stick locked. Exactly like before. The Thunderbolt shuddered violently as compressibility took hold. Booth waited 2 more seconds. The airspeed needle crept higher. 460 miles per hour. The aircraft was screaming through the air now. He reached for the landing gear lever. For just a moment he hesitated. If the gear tore off, the test would end in disaster. Then he pulled the lever. The landing gear doors slammed open. The wheels dropped into the airflow. The effect was immediate. The Thunderbolt jolted violently as massive drag slammed against the aircraft. The nose pitched upward. Booth was pressed into his seat by the sudden G-force. The airspeed needle fell rapidly. The control stick loosened in his hand. The elevators responded again. Booth pulled back gently. The nose rose. The dive flattened. 30 degrees. 20. Level flight. Altitude, 14,000 feet. He had recovered. Booth raised the landing gear. The airplane accelerated again. He climbed back to 20,000 feet. And did it again. Second dive. 460 miles per hour. Gear down. Recovery. Third dive. 470 miles per hour. Same result. Each time the aircraft slowed violently and regained control. The camera plane captured everything. When Booth landed, Zemke was already waiting on the runway. The colonel watched the film that afternoon. 3 times. Then he called every squadron commander in the group. His decision was immediate. As of that day, gear extension recovery would be authorized as an emergency procedure for Thunderbolt pilots caught in compressibility dives. Pilots were ordered to practice the technique at altitude before attempting it in combat. Within 2 weeks, every pilot in the 56th Fighter Group had tried it. Within a month, the method spread to other Thunderbolt units in England. By summer of 1944, it appeared in official pilot briefings. By autumn, it would be printed in training manuals. A 19-year-old second lieutenant had accidentally changed fighter tactics across the European theater, and he had done it simply by pulling the wrong lever.